But this is the origin of the term. Beginning in the 1880s and through the 1920s, it was applied to range management first and then game management, such as the hunting context just mentioned. Only after that did it find use in academic population biology, in studies of population growth of organisms in laboratories initially, and also after World War II, it was finally applied to human populations, which is now, I think, its most prominent use, at least in political debates. So there are a bunch of these passages. I won't probably have time to read all of them, but this is from a report to the House of Representatives from the President in 1854 describing its original use. It had to do with shipping. It came out of debates between proponents of steam-powered boats versus sail or wind-powered boats in shipping context. Debates about how to levy duties, tariffs, and taxes on shipping vessels, because the earlier methods had all relied on measurements of volume of the boat itself. And in that context, a sailboat, the volume of the hull of the vessel is basically almost entirely available for cargo. With steamboats, that wasn't the case. Steamboats had to have a whole lot of volume devoted to the steam engines and the water and the coal used to power them. And under the old system, every steamboat carrying goods would have to pay duties on the volume of the water and the coal in the engines because of the way that that volume had been earlier measured for sailboats. And the proponents of steamboats came up with this concept of carrying capacity and said, no, you should impose taxes on the basis of the amount of the boat that actually holds cargo rather than the volume of the boat as a whole. This is what the Congress is debating in this context about how to levy duties on sailboats versus steam-powered boats. There's an earlier use of this in 1845 having to do with what the Republic of Texas was doing in levying duties on boats there. So this is the origins of carrying capacity. Over time, it got applied to other kinds of means of conveyance. Here you see that it's applied to canoes. It's used to describe the elegance and beauty and effectiveness or quality of Indian birch bark canoes. It was also applied to electrical train systems or transit systems, mass transit in Paris. It was applied to electrical systems, how much electricity the lines could carry, and lightning rods. It was seen as a way of making sense of measuring and expressing the capacity of these engineered systems to convey things. Here's the capacity of the transportation of the electric road is so great in Paris. This is 1881 in science. So all of these are contexts in which these are engineered systems, right? Engineers can actually calculate the capacity of the things that they design to do various things, and knowing those capacities is an important way of designing things properly, right? Later on, it was applied to animals, first as a measure of what they could carry. So this man, again writing, I believe, in Science in 1873, describing the natives of Santo Domingo, their hunting practices, they would go into the mountains with their pack animals, and they would hunt until they had so much meat that they had as much meat as their animals could carry back out of the mountains. That was the carrying capacity of their animals for meat. This, in fact, later got applied to humans as well. There were studies done of the amount of gold or coal or other raw materials that human workers could carry all day, every day, working in mines in various places, that sort of thing. So this is all about what can you actually carry, as a kind of literal sense of carrying capacity. Yes, here we go. Before we developed tools, we could only carry what we could hold in our hands, and then we learned that we could carry more if we had tools, that kind of thing. Then it gets turned around, and it gets applied to lands, specifically pasture lands. And here it's used to describe the effects of the introduction of rabbits into New Zealand. Rabbits were a non-native species. They came in, they took over, and they had the result of stripping the land of vegetation and reducing the livestock carrying capacity of the colony of New Zealand. It was also applied in Australia. You get discussions of carrying capacity in the sense of how many animals can a square mile of land support through the year. And this is its first, this is an important shift. Instead of talking about what could an animal carry or ship, you're actually talking about how many animals can the land carry. You sort of inverted the relationship. Aldo Leopold came across that use of carrying capacity when he was working for the Forest Service, and they were instituting carrying capacities for rangelands on their grazing allotments. And he then, in turn, applied it to wildlife. And he is the origin of the thinking behind those figures I showed you at the beginning here, the uses of carrying capacity in a wildlife management context. He was working in a sense inductively. He was interested in studying actual populations of wildlife in different places. He was uncertain whether animals had a kind of intrinsic limit on how many could live in a given area just because they were that animal, or whether it varied depending on environment. And this is the binary we saw at the very beginning of the semester, right? Sort of population and environment. Population and environment. How do you calculate the population growth rate of an organism in abstraction from its environment, given that you can only ever see it in the context of its environment? And he concluded that for bobwhite quail, he was reasonably satisfied that there was a saturation point, a sort of absolute limit, that these birds could not achieve any greater density than that, no matter what. But he wasn't convinced it existed for any other species. He saw it as something that had yet to be demonstrated. He goes on, this is the key point here. The obvious lesson is not to let a good herd erupt. To prevent an eruption, this herd must be kept trimmed down to a safe margin, and the carrying capacity of the range built up so there's a safe margin of capacity above population. Game Management is the first book ever written devoted to this subject, and it is the foundation of wildlife management in this country. And he's basically saying the carrying capacity is how many animals a given range or a given habitat can support, and if you're a good game manager, you will learn to read that range, that habitat, and identify the things that are limiting in that habitat, and then improve it. Improve those things. And it might be cover one year, it might be food another year, it might be predators another year, but you can essentially increase the production of wildlife by tinkering with these factors that determine the carrying capacity of an environment. And you can't let a good herd erupt. He's referring to some very famous examples in the western U.S. in which the wolves were killed out of game preserves to protect the deer, and the deer ended up erupting. They ended up having huge population growth that resulted in overbrowsing and a collapse of the food supply, and then a collapse of the deer population afterwards. And this is why this is useful for hunters, because they can point to examples where the population of a wildlife species got too large, and you ended up with severe depletion of the environment, the habitat was destroyed, and you ended up having more deaths than you would have had if you selectively removed a few along the way, or if wolves had done the same. Yeah?
I'm just curious, in that article, I was asking the other day, I was kind of referring back to Aldo Leopold. On the same argument, the herd is making here from all the herd. Is any conversation about how well they eliminated predators?
Well, for Leopold, certainly. This is very much about the wisdom or foolishness of predator control measures. And he initially participated in killing wolves and removing predators because that was the policy of various bodies, Forest Service, Park Service, various state entities. And he later came to conclude that that was a bad policy, that the predators were needed to prevent the eruption of herds of deer, for example. But he allied himself very closely with hunters groups at various points in time and would agree with the logic that, especially if the predators have been removed, other predators need to take their place, and human predators can do that in a way that is sustainable. That was his position. Now, so here we go, yes. That's his discussion of how to manage game well. I would draw attention to, these are his italics, the range from supporting the population which the other aspects would be capable of supporting. So there's still a kind of idealism here in the sense of postulating a population number or density that could be achieved if all of the factors were in their sort of ideal condition, right? Now, Leopold actually is less guilty of this than other people, but it is still there as well. The whole point of carrying capacity, once you start applying it to these systems, is to identify something other than what you have now, right? Is to identify some kind of limit that is the sort of uppermost limit, ideal limit, or optimal limit for a population in a given place. Interestingly, at the beginning of World War II, or just before the U.S. entered World War II, Leopold gave a lecture at the University of Wisconsin, first day of the semester, and he sort of mused out loud about how you might apply ecology to politics. And he offered up the notion that ecology teaches us that when you get too many of an organism in one place, something intervenes and checks the population. And he said it can be a lot of different things. It's usually not food supply, it's usually something else, but this is something that ecology teaches us. And he goes on to suggest that perhaps war is one of these checks for humans. When you get too many people, war is one of those things that just happens, kind of like an ecological limit imposed on those numbers. And he suggests at the end of this lecture, if that's the case, why not call a moratorium on human increase? And literally, this is about 5 months before the U.S. enters World War II. It's obvious what's coming, and he is obviously concerned about it. And he is essentially proposing that perhaps one way to avoid the war would be to prevent the further growth of human populations. Eugene Odum is the next piece in this. He is the founder of the use of carrying capacity in population biology. He's one of the most famous ecologists of the 20th century. And he put this all together in one of his early textbooks, one of the very first textbooks, sort of Ecology 101 type textbooks. And he borrowed the idea of carrying capacity and used it to describe the uppermost limit of a population independently of its environment. And in this, he was drawing very heavily on preceding research done in laboratories using fruit flies and other kinds of small organisms, even microorganisms, in which scientists had been able to very carefully track the growth of the populations over time and measure how they grew. And what they had seen was that they grew in this pattern. They started out slowly increasing, and then they increased very, very quickly, and then they would reach a kind of uppermost limit. And this was even if you provided them with as much food as they needed. Just the simple limitations of space appeared to impose an uppermost limit to how big those populations could become. And Odum noticed that this was true across a range of laboratory experiments, and he also saw a similar shape to the curve in the growth rate of introduced wildlife into certain defined areas, like islands. The rabbits in New Zealand might have been another example had he had access to it. But this curve, he suggested, demonstrated both that there is such a thing as carrying capacity, that it was empirically demonstrated, and that it spoke to something he called environmental resistance, which was created by the growing population itself, and which brings about an increasing reduction in the potential reproduction rate as population size approaches its carrying capacity, the carrying capacity. And this could accommodate, by the way, situations in which there was an overshoot and then a collapse and then a sort of eventual stabilization around some kind of equilibrium, a kind of dynamic equilibrium. Now, environmental resistance is, in my opinion, a very problematic concept, and I'm going to try to explain why. He had actually borrowed it explicitly from one of these laboratory scientists who had found this curve in the case of beetles, a certain kind of beetle living in an enclosed laboratory environment full of wheat. Now, this slide is here mainly because, well, Odum, for a moment, for a couple paragraphs, sort of goes off on this little detour in his textbook talking about human population and suggesting that this concept of carrying capacity was extremely important for thinking about the world's human population and for demography. The population of the world, now about 2,200 million, is in negative acceleration phase and should reach an upper asymptote of 2.645 billion in the year 2700, provided the carrying capacity of the world of human beings is not increased by that time. One should not use the sigmoid curve to predict the maximum size of future populations of man or organisms unless one is sure that the carrying capacity of the environment will remain largely unchanged during the interval. Now, this seems kind of funny now because the estimate of future world population is so far off, but that's not really the point. The point here is that he explicitly acknowledges that carrying capacity only makes sense if environmental conditions are static. And he acknowledges that if environmental conditions are not static, then this prediction is essentially worthless. And the funny thing about it is precisely the carrying capacity, in his sense of the term, was derived from these laboratory experiments in which environmental conditions were static, right? They could be controlled, they could be made static. And to that extent, that's how you derive the sigmoid curve. The sigmoid curve is important because it allowed population biologists to express these relationships mathematically and to build mathematical models. And they went gangbusters from there, developing mathematical models to quantify and predict or project the behavior of populations in the wild. This still is done quite commonly. So finally we get to William Vogt, and he comes up in Connolly's chapter, right? He's an ornithologist who went on to be the head of the Planned Parenthood Foundation of America. He wrote this book, Road to Survival, in 1948, which until Rachel Carson came along was the most popular environmental book of all time. It reached 20 or 30 million people by some estimates. He had experience after college running a bird sanctuary, and he was well familiar with ideas of game management as Leopold had propounded them. He almost became a student of Leopold's at one point. During World War II, he was drafted, and the Army sent him all over South and Central America to do a kind of reconnaissance work. And what he essentially did was travel around rural parts of the Americas and observe the conditions in which smallholder farmers were attempting to eke out a living. And he was very strongly impressed by their poverty, and he was very concerned about issues of soil erosion and environmental degradation in these poor parts of the world. And the Army was concerned about this again because of the fear of possible communist sympathies developing in conditions of poverty. So he came back and he wrote this book, Road to Survival. Connolly suggests that Vogt's concerns when he became head of Planned Parenthood set the agenda for the next 30 years. He also points out that Vogt condemned the spraying of DDT because it allowed too many poor people to live. He basically said you're keeping them alive, and eventually they're going to die anyway because there are too many of them. Medicine shouldn't do these things. 14 years later, when Silent Spring comes out, Rachel Carson is going to make stopping the use of DDT the centerpiece of environmental activism. And she's going to do it for environmental reasons. But there was actually an alliance here between, by that point, between environmental concerns and these population control concerns. So this is the central argument he makes. This is how he frames his argument at the beginning of Road to Survival. He says C equals B over E, or in relation to E. C is a function, BE, in which C is carrying capacity, B is biotic potential, how quickly something can be produced, and E is environmental resistance. He insists that this way of thinking things is necessary to prevent nuclear holocaust, in which he said 3/4 of the world population would perish. And this goes on eventually into the work of Paul and Anne Ehrlich, who insist that carrying capacity is the key consideration for understanding overpopulation, and that the entire planet and virtually every nation is already vastly overpopulated. But if we go back to this equation, it is essentially a tautology. Because the only reason you need to even imagine that there is E is because you have first imagined C as some kind of ideal, quantifiable, static upper limit to population. And that number is essentially conceived as if environment didn't exist. Right? So if you abstract population from environment and pretend that there is such a thing as a population without environment, then you can arrive at a number for C. And then when you go back into the field, you need to imagine E as those environmental factors that prevent B from expressing itself. Right? In other words, only because you have an idealized carrying capacity do you have to imagine this thing called environmental resistance. Nonetheless, what Vogt essentially says in his work is we have to reduce environmental resistance by providing means to make the environment more bountiful. We need to provide irrigation. We need to prevent soil erosion, because otherwise environmental resistance will result inevitably in mass death. So, conclusions. You can read those yourselves. I've just more or less summarized what I think the key point is. And then finally this, if you have a chance at some point, go and look at the Carrying Capacity Network, which is one of the first sites that will pop up on Google if you Google carrying capacity, and read this. It's essentially an organization devoted to preventing immigration and stabilizing population in the name of resuscitating the Waltons. Most Americans look back on the 50s as a good time. Our homes were safe to the point where many people did not lock their doors. Public schools were excellent. Most men treated women like ladies, and most ladies devoted their time and effort to making good homes, raising their children well, and helping their communities through volunteer work. Anyway, that's just to suggest the importance of this concept even today. Thank you. Have a good break.